The wind had no direction, only rage. It tore through the narrow streets, lifting pieces of roofs, shutters, and history itself. Water rose from the gutters like an animal waking, swallowing sidewalks, porches, and the faint lines between safety and surrender. Beneath the grey swirl of the hurricane, a woman stood at her doorway, clutching the frame as the storm screamed her name. Her house trembled, her candles flickered, but her eyes stayed fixed on the alley below, where a thin, trembling stray dog fought the flood, yelping against the current. Something inside her broke open, something that had been sealed for years. Before we begin, if this story finds a place in you, if you still believe that love can come back even after everything, hit like, subscribe, and comment the city and state you're watching from. That's how I know where these stories are finding their way. Her name was Evelyn, and she had been alone long before the hurricane came. The city around her, its brass songs, its ghosts, its endless rhythm, had always felt like an echo she couldn't join. Her husband had left with the last good summer, and since then silence had been her only companion. But when she saw the dog, mud-soaked, eyes wide, body half drowned, she felt the same desperate pulse that once made her believe in love. Without thinking, she pulled on her raincoat, grabbed the lantern, and stepped into the roaring dark. The flood was colder than she expected. Every step felt like wading into memory. Cars floated like coffins, branches scraped past her knees, the air tasted of salt, oil, and iron. The dog had disappeared beneath the churning water, leaving only ripples and a fading cry. Evelyn shouted, her voice swallowed by thunder. The world seemed to end in every direction, yet she pushed forward, guided by a single spark, an instinct older than reason. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat, she saw him clinging to a floating crate. She lunged, grabbed his collar, and together they fell into the storm's mouth. When she woke, she was inside what used to be a church. The pews were half underwater, the altar drowned. The dog lay beside her, chest rising and falling faintly. She tore a strip from her sleeve and bound his bleeding paw. "You're not dying today," she whispered. The thunder rolled like an answer. The candlelight shook against the water's edge, painting crosses on the walls, ghosts of faith and ruin. Outside, the storm kept howling, but inside, for the first time in years, Evelyn felt a purpose that wasn't survival. It was connection. By dawn, the city had changed shape. Streets became rivers, doors floated, names were washed away. Evelyn carried the dog. She called him Jonah because he had survived the belly of something vast and merciless. Together they moved through silence, through the bones of the drowned neighborhood. On a rooftop, she found an old man calling for help, trapped beneath a beam. She hesitated. Saving him could mean losing Jonah. But Jonah barked, sharp and insistent, as if reminding her of the promise she had made when she chose life over fear. She pushed the beam aside, her arms burning. The man wept as she pulled him free. They stayed on that roof for 2 days, surviving on rainwater and prayer. The old man spoke of his family, of music, of faith that bent but never broke. He called Evelyn Angel, though she felt more like a ghost. On the 3rd day, rescue boats arrived. She lifted Jonah first, refusing to let go until he was safe in the soldier's arms. When it was her turn, she looked back at the house below, half buried, half forgotten. The storm had taken everything but left her with something she never knew she needed, a reason to stay alive. Months later, the city began to breathe again. Streets reopened, though many had changed forever. People rebuilt from the mud, from the memory of screams and songs. Evelyn's house stood scarred but standing. She and Jonah lived together, the silence now filled with his soft snoring, his steady heartbeat beside her bed. When the rains returned that winter, she didn't hide. She sat on the porch, lantern beside her, watching the clouds gather. The storm still frightened her, but it also reminded her of the night she chose to fight. Jonah would lift his head, ears twitching at the thunder, and she'd smile. "We made it," she'd whisper. "We'll make it again." Years passed, and the city forgot her story, as cities often do. But sometimes, after a heavy rain, neighbors would see a light glowing from Evelyn's porch, a lantern that never went out. Beside it, a gray dog sat watching the road, as if waiting for the next lost soul to call for help. And somewhere, deep inside the rhythm of New Orleans, the wind still carried her voice, a whisper that sounded like a promise. Storms may break walls, but they also uncover hearts strong enough to rebuild. When the final hurricane came decades later, rescuers found the house empty, the door open, the lantern burning bright. On the porch, two sets of footprints led into the water, one human, one canine, disappearing together into the flood. The city called it legend, but those who knew love and loss and the weight of silence understood. Some storms never end. They just find new hearts to move through. The story of Evelyn and Jonah did not end with the flood. It became something whispered between generations. Children spoke of the woman who walked through the storm and came back with a ghost at her side. Old men told it to fishermen who still feared the black water. Some swore that on quiet nights, a soft bark echoed between the levees, answered by a woman's voice humming an old hymn. But legends, like wounds, only stay open because someone keeps them alive. And in the ruins of the lower quarter, a boy named Caleb found what was left of that legend, a cracked collar with a single word carved into the leather: Jonah. Caleb was 12, the kind of boy who had already seen too much. His father was gone to the factories up north. His mother worked nights and the streets had raised him. The city still bore scars from the hurricane, though the world pretended they were healed. He carried the collar like a relic, not knowing why, only that it made him feel less invisible. That night, as another storm gathered over the river, Caleb heard a whine under the bridge. He knelt, and there, shivering, eyes bright as lightning, was a dog, the same color as the drowned earth. Without thinking, Caleb whispered, "Jonah?" The dog stepped forward, trembling. Its fur was gray with age, its eyes cloudy, yet it looked at Caleb as if it recognized something ancient. The boy offered his hand, and the creature pressed its head against his palm. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder until the streets once again ran with memory. Caleb pulled the dog close and ran through the maze of alleys toward home. Inside, the power flickered out. He lit a candle, just one the way Evelyn once did, and the flame bent low, fighting the wind. The dog lay beside him, tail thumping weakly, a living echo of a promise that refused to die. Outside, the storm grew wild. Tin roofs clattered. Sirens wailed. People shouted through the night. Caleb pressed his face into the dog's neck and whispered the same prayer Evelyn had once said, "You're not dying tonight." The dog's heartbeat slowed but steady, like thunder in the distance. Somewhere deep in the storm, a rhythm began, a pulse that matched theirs. By morning, the flood had passed. The sun rose weakly through the mist. Caleb opened the door to a city reborn again, but quieter this time, as if even the wind remembered. He stepped out barefoot, Jonah trotting at his side, both of them survivors of stories they never asked to inherit. Around them, neighbors emerged from shattered homes, exchanging looks of disbelief and laughter. One woman pointed to the sky. A rainbow arched over the river, fractured but bright, bending above the place where Evelyn's house once stood. Caleb looked at Jonah, then at the collar still hanging loose around the dog's neck. He tightened it gently and smiled. "Guess we both belong here now." As years passed, the boy grew into a man who fixed what others forgot. He rebuilt porches, patched roofs, and raised lanterns in doorways where no one dared before. People said he had a way with storms, that his voice could calm animals, that thunder always softened near his street. He never claimed to understand it, but every time the rain came, Jonah, older, slower, grayer, would rise and sit by the window as if listening for something beyond the clouds. And when Jonah's final storm arrived, Caleb carried him outside, cradled in his arms, to the same river that had once taken everything and given back hope. The rain washed over them both. "You brought her back," Caleb whispered, "and now I'll carry it on." Years later, when Caleb himself grew old, children would gather on his porch to hear him tell the story. The woman, the dog, the flood, the lantern that never went out. He never told it the same way twice, because the truth of storms isn't in what they destroy, but in what they reveal. And when his time came, the people of the quarter found his house empty, the porch lantern still burning, and two sets of prints leading down toward the river again. One man, one dog, disappearing together. The city called it legend, but those who live close to the water know every storm leaves behind a witness, and some promises are stronger than death itself. After the flood, the people who stayed behind began to rebuild, plank by plank, story by story. The city was never the same, how could it be? But its heart kept beating through hands that refused to give up. Murals bloomed on walls that once held water lines. Brass bands played again in the cracked courtyards, their music half joy, half memory. And among those rebuilding was a young woman named Amara, a nurse who had arrived from another town to help the sick. She didn't believe in ghosts or miracles. She believed in stitching what could still be saved. But that belief was tested one stormy night when she saw a light in a house that should have been abandoned. She followed it through the flooded street, her boots sinking in the mud. The light flickered behind fogged glass and she knocked. No answer. When the door creaked open, she found an old lantern burning steady on the table, and beside it, a grey dog curled in sleep, his fur wet, but his breathing calm. "Hey boy," she whispered, "where's your owner?" The tag around his neck read the same single word, Jonah. The dog lifted his head and looked at her with a strange, steady gaze. Then he stood, walked to the door and barked once, sharp and low, as if summoning her to follow. The wind outside howled and Amara almost turned back, but something in that bark felt like a plea older than fear. She grabbed the lantern and stepped out into the rain. Jonah led her through the maze of drowned alleys until they reached a small house half hidden under vines. Through a broken window, she saw a man collapsed on the floor, barely breathing. She forced the door open, dragged him out, and called for help. The man survived. He would later tell her he had been trapped for days, ready to give up, until a grey dog and a light appeared outside his window. But when Amara turned back to thank Jonah, the dog was gone. Weeks passed. The rescued man recovered, and Amara continued her work, though the story haunted her. She asked around, described the dog. The locals nodded knowingly. "That's Evelyn's lantern," one old woman said, "and her dog, but they've been gone for decades." Amara laughed, thinking it superstition. Yet every time it rained, she found the lantern's flame in her dreams, steady and bright, cutting through the water like a heartbeat. One evening, as thunder rolled again over the river, she found herself lighting her own lantern on the clinic porch. The patients called her the woman with the light, and before long, others did too. When storms came, people gathered where her lantern shone, waiting out the dark together. Years later, a child asked her why she never left the quarter. Amara smiled and said, "Because every storm needs a light to find its way home." And when she finally passed, the townspeople placed her lantern on the same porch where Evelyn's once burned. They say that now, when the river rises and thunder shakes the sky, two lights appear, side by side, burning through the rain. The first is Evelyn's, for the promise she made. The second is Amara's, for the promise she kept. And somewhere between them, the shadow of a grey dog waits, still listening for prayers carried on the wind. Decades drifted by, and the story turned into a legend whispered at bar counters and under porches when the rain came heavy. Tourists heard fragments about a woman, a lantern, and a grey dog who never died. But for the people who called the quarter home, it was something more than myth. It was memory. Each year on the anniversary of the Great Flood, a quiet vigil gathered by the riverbank. Lanterns floated on the water, hundreds of them, their light trembling against the current like scattered souls finding their way back. Among the crowd stood a girl named Lila, barely 16, clutching a small oil lamp her grandmother had given her. "Keep it lit," the old woman had said. "It'll guide you when the city forgets itself." Lila didn't know who Evelyn was or what Jonah had done, but that night, as the wind rose from the bayou and the rain began to fall, her flame refused to die. The storm grew wilder. People ran for cover, their lanterns snuffed out one by one. Only Lila's stayed burning. The current grew stronger, pulling the floating lights downstream, yet hers stayed near the shore. Through the thunder, she heard a bark, faint but certain, coming from the darkness beyond the levee. She froze. Another bark, closer this time. "Hello?" she called. Her voice shook. Out of the fog stepped a dog, soaked to the bone, fur grey as dusk. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned toward the rising water and looked back, waiting. Something ancient stirred inside her, as if she had walked into someone else's unfinished prayer. She followed. They reached a fallen tree lodged against the levee. Beneath it, a boy no older than 10 was trapped, his leg pinned under the trunk. The water was rising fast. Without hesitation, Lila set down the lantern, used both hands to push, scream, and lift, her body straining against the impossible. The grey dog barked and bit at the branches, pulling loose debris. Together they freed the boy just as the current surged. She grabbed him by the arm, pulled him up the slope, and collapsed beside him. The lantern still burned below, untouched by the flood. The boy coughed, shivering. "You saved me," he said. Lila smiled weakly. "No," she whispered. "He did." But when they looked back toward the river, the dog was gone. Only paw prints leading into the water remained. By morning, the storm had passed. The city survived again, though not without new scars. News spread of the girl who saved a boy during the flood, guided by a grey dog and a light that wouldn't die. Reporters came, cameras flashed, and stories spun like carnival songs. But Lila never spoke of what she truly saw. She just kept the lantern by her window and tended it every night. When she grew older, she became the keeper of the river's edge, the one who stayed up when storms came, the one who left her door open for strays. And some nights, when thunder rolled across the rooftops, neighbors swore they saw two figures standing by her porch, a woman in a raincoat and a dog at her feet, watching the city breathe again. The legend of Evelyn, Jonah, and the lights of New Orleans became part of the rhythm itself. Not a ghost story, not quite a miracle, but proof that compassion echoes louder than fear, and that every storm leaves behind someone willing to stand in the rain for another. Because storms are not meant to be survived alone. They are meant to remind us what survival costs and what it saves. By the next century, New Orleans had grown taller, brighter, louder. Glass towers rose beside the river, the old brick houses sinking quietly into history. Yet in the quarter, where songs still crawled out of doorways and the smell of gumbo mixed with rain, the story of the woman and the dog endured. Most thought it was folklore, just another tale to charm the tourists, but others felt something different when the sky darkened. There was a pulse beneath the cobblestones, a rhythm in the thunder that carried her name. Evelyn, Jonah, the stray and the storm. One night, during the kind of rain that turns streets into mirrors, a janitor named Thomas was closing the museum on Chartres Street. He'd worked there his whole life, sweeping between the relics of people long gone, keeping their dust company. As he locked the last door, he noticed a small light flickering outside by the old river gate. It wasn't an electric lamp. It swayed like fire. Curious, he followed it into the rain, past the alley that smelled of coffee and rust. There at the edge of the levee stood a single lantern burning bright despite the downpour. Beside it sat a dog, grey, still, watching the water. Thomas froze, heart pounding. "Hey, boy," he whispered, half afraid of the echo. The dog turned its head slowly, eyes like pale storms themselves. Then, with deliberate grace, it rose, took the lantern by the handle in its jaws, and began walking toward the old cemetery gates. Thomas followed without thinking. The rain grew heavier, but he couldn't stop. Something ancient, magnetic, pulled him along. They reached the center of the cemetery, where roots broke through stone and names had faded from time. The dog stopped beside a grave nearly lost to the earth. The lantern light revealed the inscription, faint but legible. Evelyn Hart, 1919-1983. She walked through water to find what was lost. Thomas knelt, trembling. The dog dropped the lantern onto the soil, its flame steady despite the wind. Then, for a moment, he swore he saw her, a silhouette in the raincoat, hair clinging to her cheeks, hand resting on the dog's head. No sound, no words, just the hush of rain hitting the earth. The air thickened with warmth and sorrow. When he blinked, the figure was gone, and so was the dog. The lantern burned alone. Thomas stayed there until dawn. When the sun rose, the floodwaters shimmered gold over the graves. He left the lantern where it was, still burning, still defying reason. That night, when he told his story, no one believed him. But weeks later, during another storm, the city lost power for hours, except for a faint light seen flickering in the cemetery, reflected across the wet streets like a heartbeat. Years passed. Thomas grew old, and others took over the museum. But when the hurricanes came, he would walk down to the levee, carrying his own small lantern. For the ones who came before, he'd say. He never missed a storm, no matter how fierce. And when he died, people found him sitting in his chair by the window, the lantern burning beside him, and a muddy paw print on the floor. Now, each year when the season turns and the sky begins to breathe again, people leave candles on windowsills all over the quarter. They say it's tradition, but no one really knows why. And yet somehow the city never forgets. Every flame that survives the wind is a quiet thank you to a woman who walked into a storm and a dog who refused to let her drown. Because every storm ends, but some hearts keep burning long after the rain. There are nights when the wind comes up from the Gulf, like an old voice calling home. It moves through the alleys, through the broken shutters, through the songs still clinging to the walls of bars that never close. The locals say you can tell when another storm is coming, not by the air pressure or the smell of salt, but by the way the lights along the river flicker all at once, like the city itself remembering something. That was one of those nights. A young saxophonist named Ray was playing under the awning of a cafe when the wind began to shift. He played to survive. Tips in his case, rain on his shoulders, the hum of thunder blending with his song. The melody he played was old, older than he knew, something passed from ear to ear since before the levees broke. As he reached the final note, lightning split the sky. The power across the street went dark. Only one light stayed on, a lantern, burning steady beside the river. Ray felt the pull before he could explain it. He left his saxophone on the chair and walked toward the glow. The streets were empty, rain hitting in sheets so thick it blurred the world. When he reached the levee, the air smelled of metal and time. The lantern swayed slightly, but its flame didn't falter. And next to it, in the flicker, stood a dog, gray fur soaked through, eyes like thunderclouds waiting to break. "Hey, buddy," Ray said softly. "You lost?" The dog tilted its head, then started walking toward the cemetery path. Without knowing why, Ray followed. Inside the gates, water pooled between the stones. The dog stopped at a familiar grave, one Ray had passed 1,000 times without reading. This time he saw it clearly. Evelyn Hart. Beneath it, the same words the janitor once saw. She walked through water to find what was lost. Ray kneeled. The wind roared, shaking the trees, but he stayed still. When he looked up again, the dog was gone. In its place, resting against the stone, was a piece of rusted metal. He picked it up. It was a collar tag, smoothed by years, the engraving faint but clear. Jonah. The storm reached its peak. He clutched the tag, closed his eyes, and whispered a prayer he didn't know he remembered. When morning came, the cemetery was dry again. The tag was gone, but Ray's lantern, he didn't remember bringing one, burned at his side, faint and golden. From that day, he carried that flame everywhere he played. He called his new song, "The Stray and the Storm." People said it felt different, like the rain was in the melody, like it remembered something bigger than the notes. And whenever the hurricanes rolled in, Ray would leave the city and walk to the river with his lantern. Locals would watch from their windows as he stood there, waiting for the first lightning strike. Sometimes, they said, a gray shadow sat beside him, tail swaying gently in rhythm with the thunder. The years turned, the music spread, and the story lived on, changed, retold, forgotten, rediscovered. But its truth stayed the same. Storms take, but they also return what the heart refuses to lose. In the end, every soul in New Orleans learns that light never survives by chance. It survives because someone keeps it burning. And somewhere, beyond the sound of the saxophone and the whisper of the levee wind, a woman's voice still hums. A prayer, a promise, a song older than the storm itself. Decades slipped into centuries. The city rebuilt itself over and over again, the way a wound becomes scar and a scar becomes memory. The river widened, the skyline climbed, and the storms, always the storms, kept returning like old friends with new faces. By then, most people didn't believe in Evelyn Hart or Jonah the dog. They believed in data, in barriers, in forecasts. They called it progress. But there are some things progress can't bury. One evening in the year 2181, a young climatologist named Naomi stood on the new floodwall, watching the radar glow red. She'd studied the old files, the century-old testimonies from the Great Flood of 1961, but what drew her here wasn't research. It was a recurring dream, a lantern burning in water, a voice whispering her name through static. Now the dream was real. The sky boiled black, the sirens wailed, and the levees trembled like lungs before a scream. She ran toward the old quarter, the one section the engineers hadn't touched, a relic preserved under glass and bureaucracy. But the gates were open, and the rain had already found its way in. Streets became rivers, just as the archives had described. She waded through knee-deep water, lightning splitting the sky above the cathedral spires. That's when she saw it, a faint golden light at the far end of the street, steady against the chaos. A lantern, ancient, glowing as if the air itself remembered how to hold fire. Naomi reached it, trembling. The glass was unbroken. The flame burned clean. Beneath it, half buried in silt, was a nameplate so corroded it took her a moment to read. Jonah. Behind her came a sound, low, rhythmic, alive. She turned. A dog stood in the floodwater, grey as smoke, watching her. Its fur hung heavy, eyes glowing with the reflection of the lantern's flame. She dropped to her knees, heart pounding. "You're not real," she whispered. The dog stepped closer, pressing its muzzle against her hand. The contact was warm, human, real. When the next wave hit, she grabbed the lantern and followed him through the drowning streets. He led her past collapsed bridges and burning signs until they reached the new flood wall. There she climbed to the top, raising the lantern high. The stormlight hit the glass and scattered into a beam that pierced the rain like sunrise. The wind howled, the power grid failed, yet every emergency beacon across the district suddenly flickered back to life, following that signal of fire in the flood. By morning, thousands were alive who would have drowned. Rescue drones traced their coordinates to the single beacon, the one Naomi carried. But she was gone. The lantern floated near the wall, still burning. No body, no footprints, only a trail of paw prints leading back into the river. In the years that followed, the new city built a shrine around that lantern. They called it the Promise Light. Pilgrims came from faraway coasts to see it, burning without oil, untouched by wind. Scientists couldn't explain it. They stopped trying. Instead, they left flowers, dog collars, and written prayers beneath the glass. And every century, when another storm gathers and the river rises, the light begins to flicker again. Some say it's just the pressure of the wind. Others say it's Jonah waiting, still guarding the souls who haven't yet learned what Evelyn once did, that salvation isn't given, it's chosen, in the moment you step into the flood for someone else. Some legends end in silence. This one ends in flame, because the city never forgot how to listen when the storm speaks. By the year 2330, the city had changed again, yet the river kept its old voice. Machines cleaned the water, drones patrolled the sky, and the air hummed with invisible currents. Still, when the wind turned warm and electric, everyone knew what it meant. Another storm was coming. They said it like an invocation, half fear, half reverence. In the center of the rebuilt city stood the glass dome known as the Museum of Resilience, where the Promised Light burned day and night. Visitors came to watch it flicker, to feel something ancient move behind the hum of the machines. Among the visitors that season was a young boy named Gabriel. He had no family left. The storm of that year had already taken them. He wandered the city in silence until a rescue team brought him to the dome. There, he sat cross-legged before the light, watching it dance across his reflection. The volunteers said he didn't speak, but that night, when they turned away, he whispered one word into the glass: Jonah. The flame shivered, then steadied. That same night, the storm broke. The sky cracked open, pouring the ocean back over the city. Sirens blared, drones screamed warnings, but the people inside the dome refused to leave. They said the light would protect them. As the flood rose, the generators failed. The great city of metal fell silent, except for the sound of the wind and one boy's voice singing softly to himself. Gabriel had never learned the words, but his melody was old. The same hymn Evelyn had once whispered through the dark. The water climbed higher. The dome trembled. The light dimmed. Then, through the roar of the hurricane came a bark, low, steady, defiant. Gabriel turned and saw him, a dog standing in the rising water, fur shining silver under the lightning. He carried the lantern's flame in his eyes. Without fear, Gabriel waded toward him. The glass cracked above. The city groaned. Yet the boy and the dog stood face to face, as if time itself had folded in half to bring them together. "Are you here for me?" he asked. The dog pressed forward, nudging his hand, and in that moment Gabriel understood. He wasn't being saved. He was being asked to carry the light forward, as others had done before him. He took the lantern, raised it above his head, and for the last time in the history of that city, the old flame burned against the storm. Witnesses later said the glow stretched miles, lighting rooftops, rivers, and hearts. When the storm finally passed, the dome was gone. In its place, a field of glass shimmered under the sun. At its center, a single lantern floated in the shallows, untouched, still burning. No one ever found the boy or the dog. The flood maps marked the area as sacred ground, and a new settlement rose around it. a quiet one built by those who remembered. They called it Heart's Haven, after the woman who first stepped into the flood centuries before. Every generation, when the winds begin to turn, the people gather by the water with their lanterns. They don't pray for safety, they pray for courage, to walk into the storm for someone else. And on those nights, when the thunder sounds like a heartbeat and the rain glows faintly gold, you can still see a shape moving along the levee. A grey dog, walking beside the water, stopping at every lantern to make sure the flame still burns. He never stayed long. He never needed to, because the promise was kept. The stray and the storm had become one, the heart of a city that refused to die, and the light that even time could not drown. Centuries turned until even the memory of New Orleans slipped beneath silt and legend. The sea had swallowed most of the southern lands, leaving only chains of islands where people lived in floating houses tethered to the ruins of the old world. They called that place the Delta of Lanterns. At night, the horizon shimmered with thousands of tiny flames drifting over the water, each one lit in honor of the nameless souls who once fought the storms. None of the islanders knew how the tradition began, yet every child was taught the same warning: never let your lantern go out before dawn, or the river will forget your name. Among those children was Mira, a quiet girl who lived with her grandmother in a house built from driftwood and the remains of a church bell. Every night her grandmother told the same story about a woman named Evelyn, a grey dog named Jonah, and a light that could outlast the sea. Mira listened, half believing, half dreaming. But when the great tempests of the New Age returned, belief became her only anchor. The first storm struck during the harvest moon. Winds screamed across the archipelago, pulling roots from soil and roofs from homes. Mira held her lantern close, hands trembling, flame shrinking to a single ember. Her grandmother shouted for her to stay inside, but the walls were giving way, water flooding through the floorboards. Mira heard a howl outside, deep, guttural, impossible. She opened the door and stepped into the dark. There, in the blur of rain and lightning, stood a dog, grey, lean, soaked in salt water, its eyes twin reflections of her dying flame. It barked once and began walking toward the pier. Against every instinct, Mira followed. The pier was half gone, the sea rising to swallow it whole. The dog stopped, looked back and waited. Mira reached the end of the pier as waves crashed over her knees. The dog barked again, and she saw something floating far out. People trapped on the remains of a capsized boat, their voices faint through the wind. She raised her lantern high, its light cutting through the storm. The survivors saw it, a signal, fragile but clear, and began swimming toward her. She held the flame until her arms burned. When they reached the shore, she collapsed, breathless. The dog was gone. Only paw prints shimmered in the rain. By morning, the storm had passed. Dozens were alive because of that light. Mira's grandmother found her asleep beside the extinguished lantern, her hair tangled with seaweed and salt. "You brought them home," she whispered. Mira smiled weakly. "He showed me how." From then on, Mira became the keeper of the Delta. Every year when the tempests gathered, she walked the piers with her lantern. Sailors left offerings at her door: ropes, shells, scraps of metal, all engraved with a single word: Jonah. When she grew old, she taught the children what her grandmother once told her, that storms remember kindness, and that light is stronger when shared. One night, when the tide was red and the sky a mirror of fire, Mira vanished. The people searched the shores for days. All they found was her lantern, floating unbroken in the waves, burning brighter than ever. Now when the sea winds return and the world goes quiet, travelers say they hear two sounds woven through the rain: the cry of a woman and the bark of a dog, echoing across the flooded bones of a city that once was. And somewhere beneath those waters, the heart of the old river still beats, whispering the same truth it's carried for 1,000 years, that love, once lit, can survive any storm. In the far future, the sea finally claimed what remained of land, and the world became a vast archipelago of memory. Generations passed on floating towns built from scavenged steel and coral, tethered to fragments of what once was a continent. Humanity learned to drift rather than to anchor. They no longer spoke of countries, only of currents. Still, among all the maps and machines, one legend remained unchanged: the story of the stray and the storm. Mariners carried it across oceans, whispering it to children who had never seen a shore. They said that somewhere, at the edge of the world, there was still a lantern burning that no tide could drown. In one of these drifting colonies lived a girl named Solène. She worked as a mechanic, repairing windsails and desalination engines. But what fascinated her most wasn't the machinery, it was the old stories. Her grandfather, a historian of forgotten things, kept a book sealed in glass, a fragment of paper with a charcoal drawing of a woman and a dog beneath a storm. The caption read, "Evelyn Hart and Jonah, 1961. Most people thought it was mythology. Solène didn't. She had dreamt of the grey dog since childhood, always watching her from the end of a pier made of stars. When the great surge came, it arrived without warning. The horizon turned black, the wind howled like a beast, and towers of water rose higher than mountains. The colony's anchors snapped. Solène ran to the deck, gripping her tools, shouting for others to seal the bulkheads. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant she saw it, a faint flickering glow deep within the storm's eye. It was impossible, a lantern burning in open sea. Yet there it was, and something inside her knew it was calling. She tied herself to the mast and pointed the vessel toward it. The crew screamed, but she didn't hear. The wave hit like a wall. Everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, there was silence, an impossible stillness after so much chaos. Her ship was gone. She floated among debris, rain falling softly, and in front of her, standing impossibly on the water, was the grey dog, Jonah. His eyes reflected the stormlight, not as menace, but as memory. He turned, began walking toward the far horizon, and the sea beneath his paws shimmered gold. Solène followed, her body weightless, pulled by a force older than gravity. They walked until the storm opened, revealing a circle of calm. In its center stood a single tower of light, glass, coral, and fire woven together, rising from the ocean floor. Around it, thousands of lanterns floated in spirals, their flames bright as constellations. Solène understood then. Every soul who had ever carried the flame was here. Evelyn, Naomi, Mira, Caleb, all the names washed away by centuries, now glowing in the great sea of remembrance. Jonah stopped before the tower, looked back at her, and bowed his head. The wind carried a voice, not from his mouth, but from the air itself. "Keep it burning." Solène reached out. The tower pulsed once, then released a fragment of light that drifted into her hands. It felt alive, like a heartbeat. She placed it inside her chest, and when she looked again, Jonah was gone. When the storm cleared days later, rescuers found Solène unconscious on a raft made of driftwood, glowing faintly in the night. She survived, but her hair had turned white, and her eyes shimmered like reflected flame. She built a new colony atop the calm sea where she had awoken, and there she raised a beacon, one that never went dark. Generations later, travelers would find it still shining. Its keeper long vanished. They called it the Light of Heart's Line, believing it marked the path to safe waters. But those who stayed long enough, on the quiet nights, when the waves breathed slow, swore they could hear it, soft, steady, eternal, the echo of a woman's voice calling through time, answered by the bark of a dog somewhere beyond the horizon. And so the legend endured, not as myth, not as miracle, but as the memory of everything that survives, because someone refused to let go. The storm ends. The sea sleeps. But the light never dies. The ocean ruled for 1,000 more years, and people became creatures of the tide. They built floating cathedrals powered by wind and memory, each carrying fragments of stories that refused to drown. The old world was gone, but its pulse still moved through the waves, humming beneath the decks like a song too ancient to name. Sailors spoke of a current that circled the equator, gentle but unending, always lit by an unseen glow beneath the water. They called it the Heart Stream. Scientists mapped it and failed to explain it. Poets simply said it was where the earth remembered love. From this drifting age came another keeper, an orphaned boy named Theo, born on a vessel called Evelyn's Dream. His first sight of the world was light on water. His first sound was thunder. The crew raised him on stories, and every version ended the same way, with a lantern, a grey dog, and a choice between fear and compassion. When he turned 16, they gave him a pendant shaped like a flame and told him the legend was his to carry now. Theo laughed. thinking it just a sailor's blessing. He didn't know that the sea listens when a heart is named. The day came when the winds changed direction, an omen of something colossal. The radar towers flickered, and the ocean began to boil. Captains shouted orders, ships turned in panic, but Theo stayed on deck, drawn toward a faint glow on the horizon. It pulsed like a heartbeat through the fog. Against every command, he untied one of the smaller boats and sailed toward it alone. The further he went, the calmer the sea became. Then the fog broke, and he saw it, a vast ring of light spinning slowly on the water, every droplet glimmering gold. In its center stood a single figure, a dog, gray as dawn, tail swaying gently. Theo's voice shook. "Jonah?" The dog barked once. The sound echoed like thunder under glass. Then, as if answering, the ocean rose in a spiral, lifting both of them into the air. Beneath them shimmered the ruins of a city, endless and silent, its towers coated in coral and memory. Theo gasped. He knew it instantly, the lost foundation of New Orleans. The heartstream wasn't a current. It was the pulse of that buried city, still glowing from the promise that had once been made. Jonah stepped forward until their eyes met. The pendant around Theo's neck grew warm, its metal turning to light. The dog leaned close, touching his forehead to the boy's chest. The warmth spread through Theo's body until he could no longer tell where he ended, and the sea began. The lantern flame, the same that had passed from Evelyn to Naomi, from Mira to Selene, now lived inside him. The storm struck. Winds raged, waves clawed the sky, but Theo stood at the center of it all, calm as the eye itself. His ship foundered miles away, but from its broken hull, the crew saw something impossible. A human figure standing atop the waves, a lantern of pure light burning in his hands, and beside him a gray dog made of water and flame. Together they walked into the horizon, and the storm dissolved behind them like mist. When the survivors returned to the floating cities, they spoke of what they'd seen. Most didn't believe them, but the storms changed after that day. They still came, still tested, but never again destroyed. It was as if something in the heart of the sea had learned mercy. People built shrines to the boy and the dog of light. No one knew their names, but deep below the currents, the ruins of New Orleans glowed faintly each night, an eternal lantern beneath the world. In the end, it wasn't just a story about storms or faith. It was about every hand that ever reached into the flood for something worth saving. And when the final generation drifted beyond the last horizon, they found comfort in the legend whispered by waves. That love began as a woman's courage, grew through 1,000 storms, and became the heartbeat of the ocean itself. The stray still walks the tide, and the light, forever, still burns. 1,000 years later, the sea began to retreat. The storms, once endless, grew tired. The world, exhausted by its own fury, exhaled. Islands that had slept underwater for ages rose again, glistening with salt and memory. Where there had been only horizon, land appeared, green, trembling, ancient. People called this rebirth the resurfacing. They came from their floating cities to walk on ground for the first time in generations, their feet sinking into soil instead of waves. In this new dawn, the descendants of those who once followed the light began to build again. They found remnants of old cities beneath the coral, broken glass, iron bones, and statues that looked like they were still listening. And in one place, at the center of what the maps called Delta Reborn, they uncovered something unexpected, a tower made of fused glass and stone, still warm to the touch. Inside it, protected from the centuries, a lantern burned, alive, steady, eternal. The scholars called it the Heart of Hearts line. They said it was an ancient machine that generated light from magnetic pressure, but the elders, those who still whispered the songs of the sea, shook their heads. "No," they said, "that's a promise." Among those who came to study the flame was a young historian named Arin. He'd read every account of Evelyn Hart and Jonah, tracing the legend from myth to memory. When he first saw the lantern, he felt something like recognition, a quiet pulse behind his ribs that matched its rhythm. He spent nights alone beside it, listening. Some nights, he swore he heard the sound of rain, even when the sky was clear. Other nights, a distant bark. One evening, while recording notes, the lantern flickered for the first time in history. Alarms blared. The technicians panicked. But Arin stayed still, hand on the glass. The flame dimmed to a point of gold, then surged outward, filling the chamber with light. When it faded, the tower walls glowed faintly, and on the ground before him lay a single object, an iron collar, rusted but unbroken. He lifted it carefully. The inscription was almost erased, but one word remained: Jonah. That night, a storm unlike any in centuries swept over the delta. The people fled inland, but Aaron remained by the tower, guarding the flame. The wind roared with voices, thousands layered into one. He understood then it wasn't just Evelyn's light, it was every soul who had ever carried it. And now, the storm wanted it back. Aaron lifted the collar and placed it around his wrist. The metal burned, fusing with his skin. He raised his arm toward the sky and the lantern responded, its light shooting upward in a column so bright it split the clouds. The hurricane froze around it, rain suspended mid-air, thunder turned to silence. Then in that stillness a grey shape stepped from the light. Jonah, older than time, eyes calm as dawn. He looked at Aaron once, then lay at his feet, resting his head on the ground as if to say, "It's yours now." The light expanded, swallowed them both, and vanished. When the storm passed, the tower was empty. Only the flame remained, flickering quietly as if nothing had happened. The elders came and bowed their heads. "The line continues," they said, and so it did. Generations later, children played around that same light. They called it the dog star on earth, and when the wind rose at dusk, the flame would dance, casting two shadows against the wall, one of a man and one of a dog. The scholars still search for the truth. The faithful already know it. The stray walks still, the storm remembers, and the light waits for the next heart, brave enough to carry it. They say that when the world finally grew quiet, when storms became whispers and the ocean forgot its rage, people began to dream again, not of conquest, not of survival, but of memory. In the reborn cities, children learned of Evelyn Hart and the grey dog who walked through the flood. They learned of every soul who carried the light after her, through centuries of wind and water. The story had no beginning anymore, and no end. It was just there, woven into the rhythm of the rain, carved into the bones of the earth. On the night of the 1000th calm tide, the last keeper of records sealed the archives beneath the tower. Her name was Ione. Before locking the door, she bent over the eternal lantern and whispered a prayer, one that wasn't written in any language, only felt. The flame flickered once, as if nodding. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, not as threat, but as heartbeat. And when she stepped out into the new world, she saw something glimmering along the horizon, 1,000 small lights drifting over the sea, each one carried by hands she would never meet. They were sailors, wanderers, dreamers, every flame a promise, every glow a remembrance. Somewhere among them, perhaps unseen, a grey shadow walked the waterline, tail cutting the mist, guarding the path between storm and dawn. The wind changed. It smelled of salt and life. Ione smiled and whispered to the horizon, "You made it." Then she walked inland toward a sunrise, clean and gold, leaving the tower behind with its steady, living flame. So the story closes as it began, not in darkness but in light. The stray still walks, the storm still listens, and the heart of the world still burns with everything worth saving. Because what began as a single act of mercy became the oldest truth the earth remembers, that love once given can never be drowned. Long after Ione's footsteps faded into dust, the tower remained, alone but alive, its glass breathing with the pulse of the flame inside. Centuries folded like pages, civilizations rose and fell, languages changed, yet the story endured in ways no record could contain. It moved through lullabies, through the quiet songs sung by mothers to children during the rainy season. The words shifted, but the essence stayed. A woman who faced the flood, a dog who never left her side, and a light that could not die. The scholars of the far future would argue that the lantern was a relic of early energy technology. Poets would say it was the soul of the river itself. But on the nights when the tides glowed and the wind hummed like distant thunder, even the most skeptical could feel it. A warmth under the ribs, like the echo of a memory that wasn't theirs. The light was never meant to be understood. It was meant to be carried, and so it was. 1,000 generations later, in a time when stars could be reached and seas charted like veins, a traveler named Oral left the world behind in search of what his ancestors had called the beginning flame. His ship sailed beyond the solar winds, guided by fragments of myth. He didn't expect to find anything, but deep in the black between galaxies, sensors caught a pulse, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of a human heart. Oral followed it until the darkness broke open, revealing something that should not have existed, a tower of light standing on nothing, surrounded by the reflection of all the waters that ever were. He stepped outside his vessel, weightless. The air, or what felt like air, carried the scent of rain. At the tower's base lay an old lantern, burning exactly as it had in the archives, and beside it, sitting in patient silence, was a grey dog. His fur shimmered with constellations, his eyes 2 stars reflecting everything that had ever been lost and found again. Oral knelt. The dog leaned forward, pressing its head against his chest, and in that instant, every flood, every storm, every heartbeat that had ever carried the flame returned as light. The universe exhaled. The tower rose, flaring brighter than the dawn of any sun. When the light faded, the traveler was gone. Only the lantern remained, floating through the dark between worlds. It still burns there, waiting for the next soul brave enough to follow the glow through the storm. And somewhere beyond time, Evelyn walks beside her faithful stray once more, whispering through the silence that stretches between stars. We kept the promise.